And thank you everyone for being here. I know we're in a pandemic, the weather's been crazy recently, so I appreciate you being here. I really look forward to meeting you during the breakout sessions. Also want to say a huge thank you to 50 Years and to Impact.Tech for what you do in putting these events together, for supporting deep tech and for connecting institutional research with meaningful commercialization. So we all appreciate that. And then last but not least, thank you to David and Alex and Shuo for helping to put this together and to run this event. I appreciate it. So I first want to take you back to the 1930s in New York City. Here's a picture of that here. These are the days of cholera. Darwin was just finding evidence for evolution, really, and slavery was still a thing. People still owned other people. The Industrial Revolution had been pretty well baked into society by this point, but the sewing machine hadn't been introduced yet. So it kind of meant that if people were lucky, they had a few outfits to their name. People didn't have much clothing, and the clothing that they did have, they'd have to constantly mend and repair. So this is the way of life. This is the number of outfits we'd have to revert back to if we were to achieve a sustainable fashion industry with the practices in place today. And when I say sustainable, I mean that the earth can indefinitely sustain it. And I feel like that's how we should look at sustainability. Instead, the fashion industry generally defines it, at least when you see it in use, as something that's less bad for the environment. So I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm pretty happy with my current setup, with the amount of clothing that I have. And since probably most of us are not ready to give up our way of life and how much clothing we have, we need to really find groundbreaking solutions in order to achieve a sustainable industry. Fashion is over a $1 trillion market. It's the second largest consumer sector after food. We spend most of our lives in clothing. It's a necessary thing, but what we can't have is its horrendous impact on our planet, especially in waste, pollution, and climate change impact. In terms of waste, we dump an entire garbage truck of clothing every single second. This is equivalent of 92 million tons per year of garbage. That's straight from clothing. In terms of pollution, over 20% of the world's water pollution is attributed to the fashion industry. And then in terms of climate change impact, it's slated that the fashion industry will use over a quarter of the world's 2°C carbon budget by 2050. And that's way too much for just the stuff that we wear to take up. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, so I'm just going to stop on that part. You all know the negative impact of the industry. What I want to focus today on is looking at the history of clothing, from the very first clothing that historians, anthropologists, and archaeologists have found, and how that's led to where we find ourselves today and the devastation that's caused from the industry. Then I want to showcase promising new tech, innovations, and business models, the kind of overarching themes for where the industry is headed. And finally, I want to end with what kinds of solutions I think can help save us. Before we dive into the history, I just want to review very quickly why we wear clothing to begin with. And we wear clothing for a few reasons. First one's pretty obvious, that it's protection, that it's protection from the cold, from the sun, from the elements. It's really to protect us. Another is self-expression. This is sometimes overlooked. We really say a lot through the clothes that we wear. It's sort of like body language. It really talks about our identity, our culture. And I know people who, they'll close their eyes, grab into the drawer and pick out a t-shirt and some sweatpants, and they'll claim, no, I'm not communicating anything with what I'm wearing because I don't put any thought into it. And I would say that's not true at all. You're absolutely communicating a lot with what you chose not to wear also. And then the last thing is fitting into your community. So social norms of your community and the just straight up modesty that you need to have being part of that society. Really, no other species on Earth that we know wears clothing. So we're very unique in that sense. Okay, having established that, let's dive into the history of clothing manufacturing as we know it. It's really difficult to know when exactly humans started wearing clothing, because the clothing that would have been worn composts very quickly and doesn't fossilize. There's some research that suggests modern humans started wearing clothing or really wrapping themselves in hides when they were first exposed to ice age conditions. This was about 170,000 years ago. So how do researchers find out, considering that clothing back then would compost and wouldn't fossilize? Funny enough, what they used was lice. Researchers can DNA sequence lice to see when clothing lice, which is a different thing than hair lice, when the clothing lice evolved from hair lice, which they then presume to be roughly around the time that clothing started being worn. Another thing researchers believe is that how clothing was worn and made, is the main reason why modern humans survived while Neanderthals died out, which is about 40,000 years ago. Neanderthals had only scrapers for making their clothing, while modern humans had blades and needles. During the coldest periods of the Ice Age, it would have been really difficult to survive with clothing made with just scrapers, because it would have just been a big chunk of hide. Compared to blades and needles, where you could then cut up the garment and sew it back together in a form that would really keep you much warmer and allow you to survive. So after hides, we actually come to textiles. And the first textile was developed by felting. And felting's rubbing wool fibers together until their scales lock together. It was possible to achieve these very simple shapes you see here, these kind of hats, through felting. Since felted fabric is made straight from fiber, there's no yarn involved, it's relatively weak, and almost no clothing is made through felted fiber these days. So probably not coincidentally, yarn and yarn-based goods emerged pretty soon after the end of the last ice age. It could have been that hides became too heavy, too warm, and yarn is made by twisting fibers together. So now we're not going straight into the fabric and the garment like is shown here. We're going to instead take those fibers, twist them together into really long pieces. The first way that we believe that then these yarns were taken and made into a garment or a fabric was through this thing called knot binding. So this is similar to what we know as knitting, but it is a different technique. It was lots of little knots of yarn, and it would go around and around and around, and then would kind of coil up all the way to the top. So this was invented 6500 BC, but even the Vikings were using this, and they weren't around until the 800s AD. So this lasted as a technique for a really long time, and it kept them pretty warm. All right, so we have yarn now. We can do things beyond knot binding with yarn. The area of Egypt was one of the first places to develop weaving, which is no surprise because they weren't looking for the warmth that knot binding afforded, because knot binding, traps a lot of air in its loops. Instead, Egypt was looking for a breathable sun cover in the heat of the Middle East. The fibers available, which were mostly flax, what we think of as kind of linen, were much better for weaving. Also, since they're very rigid, they really don't want to bend and become knots in knot binding. So instead of making lots of little knots, they interwove those yarns together into a woven fabric. As we progress through all these developments, you can see a trend in automating with machines. We transition from weaving by hand here, which includes shedding or moving the heddles or the yarns by hand, and the shuttle, the piece that goes across by hand, to then mechanizing the heddle shifts with a foot pedal, which was done in 300 AD. This really sped up the process and allowed for a lot more fabric to be made by just one person alone. So felting, knot binding, and weaving are now available. But people wanted an even stretchier, even warmer type of fabric. So knitting was developed. It was based off of knot binding, of course, but its needles didn't have eyelets. All knitting was done with hand needles like this until the 1500s, with a push for science and engineering during the Renaissance, because lots of mechanisms were developed then, and then they could apply that to the machines. So that eventually led to the hand-operated knitting machine at the end of the 1500s, which replaced a lot of people knitting by hand. This was very controversial because people knitting by hand, this was definitely an occupation. It's what paid people. And there were a lot of complaints at the time because of the job displacement. So that's not unlike what we're hearing about today. And I think we don't necessarily regret what happened back then. So I think there are a lot of things for us to learn about how that happened back then. And then not even 200 years later, we leapt in technology with steam power powering our machines during the Industrial Revolution. At the same time, the water frame machine, which spun and twisted yarn using water power, was developed. So we got water power, steam power, electricity now coming into play and really making this much more efficient. So a whole industry was born around knitting and weaving fabrics. The large amount of money that it took to build these factories, though, really pushed owners to produce and to sell as much as possible, understandably. So still part of the Industrial Revolution, the cotton gin sped up production processes immensely, but specifically at the beginning of the process. The cotton gin removes the seeds from cotton bolls, leaving just the fibers. So basically, before this, people had to do this by hand. So what they would do is go get the cotton balls, so the balls of cotton from the farm and bring them inside, and then take them apart by hand, get all of the extra bits from like the seeds and the debris out of that, so they would just leave the fiber. So now with the cotton gin, you could just run it through and the machine would do it all by itself. So some say since its development was so efficient at cleaning the cotton, it increased demand for cotton and therefore it increased demand for slavery. And I think that's a pretty easy argument to make. One of my favorite developments happened just 10 years later. This was a new take on the loom altogether. Rather than using a standardized weave pattern, say over, under, where you have weaving over and under, it would allow every single yarn to be on its own control. So you didn't have to go over under, you could kind of choose a more particular pattern. So every huddle though, either moves up or down. If it moves up, the warp would cover the weft yarn. If it moves down, the weft yarn will cover the warp yarn. And if those are all different colors, they start to determine what that final like image is like. So this is how tapestries were made. It's not how tapestries were invented. Tapestries were done before this by hand, but it made it much less painstaking and made it faster. But the really cool thing here is that this was the precursor to the computer. These punch cards here had programmed, like a pre-programmed design inserted into it, built into it, so that when those were put into the machine could read out what that particular design would be. And this is a binary system. So you either had a punch or no punch. So it's kind of like a 0 or a 1 that you would see today in binary code. So if you had a punch, then the pin that was above and controlling the heddle would go down and that heddle would move up. And if it didn't have a punch, that pin wouldn't go down and the heddle would stay where it is. And so that's kind of what controlled the pattern. So all of these things that we just talked about, these were all developed before the sewing machine was developed. That meant that all clothing that we saw to this point had been stitched by hand, someone sitting there stitching by hand. And with the advent of the sewing machine, those many, many yards of fabrics that were being produced in the Industrial Revolution of the late 1700s can now be efficiently sewn into garments. The machine didn't catch on in homes until the 1850s, though, with Singer's version. Singer's version had a much smaller size. Its needle was a lot stronger. And then it also had a feed mechanism. So the mechanism that pulls the fabric through as it's being sewn at a very consistent rate. Previously, people had to do that by hand, and that took a lot of skill to be very consistent. The cost of it was pretty expensive. It was $100 at the time, which is about $3,300 in today's money. But this was something that people needed. They were making clothing for themselves to survive. So it was something people were willing to buy. And Singer also introduced installments. So it made it much more palatable to purchase this. So as expected, sewing machines unlocked production efficiencies, leading to a ton of factories. The garment industry was actually the biggest employer in New York City in 1900. Around then, factory-made store-bought clothing became available, but it was still out of reach for most people. At the time, the average family had a $750 annual income, and they spent about 15% of that, or just over $100, on clothing. So take note of that. We're going to review that number later. With sewing machines and efficient factories, women's ready-to-wear suits were an affordable, quote unquote, affordable $15, which is about $400 today. Department stores built up around these production efficiencies as well. They introduced the idea of consolidating really large amounts of mass-produced goods for the public. And they even included restaurants and other goods to kind of lure people in. These stores understandably became strong platforms for feeding up the new styles on a more consistent basis to people. So now new fashions, new trends were appearing every single season. So that's two to four times a year. Whereas before this, industrialization styles would be kind of in for many years at a time. There really wasn't a platform like this to introduce people to things on a consistent basis. So by the 1920s, the average man had about 6 outfits and the average woman had about 9 outfits. So that's way up from what we saw in the 1830s at the very beginning, when there were just a couple of outfits if someone was very lucky. So the industry is chugging away at the same clip. It was interrupted by two huge world wars. But from those wars emerged materials that have since changed the industry for the better and the worse. Synthetics. Synthetics offered really new characteristics like sweat wicking, stretch, and especially affordability. Affordability is really the main part here. Rayon imitated silk, acrylic imitated wool, and then polyester was its whole new thing, was a whole new material. And people were spending just over 10% of their $4,000 income on clothing. So that number went down from, we just saw 15% half a century before this. Sears and Montgomery Ward catalogs reached a lot of people. That was kind of the new platform. And with these new economies of scale that they had, they were able to reduce their prices, along with the introduction of synthetics that really reduced costs on materials. Sears' 1955 catalog sold a $16 nylon dress. $16 is about $130 now, and that was considered pretty cheap. And it was likely still made in the US because over 95% of the clothing that was sold in the US was actually made in the US. So with synthetics and cheap materials came this concept of disposability, pretty literally. Fortunately, this fad for disposable clothing, which was made mostly of cheap non-woven synthetics, didn't last more than a few years. But the idea was that you had a synthetic that was just being extruded into just a amorphous like matrix of fiber that was just a non-woven, and it was almost like you were making paper towel quality fabric. And then sometimes I would get stitched together, maybe heat bonded together, and sold that way. And the expectation was, this is so poorly made that good luck if it lasts one sitting. So that fortunately didn't last very long. That was only a fad for a couple of years. And then in the 70s, computers started being applied to things all over the world, industries all over the world, including to textile machinery. They were still really clunky though, and computers weren't widely adopted, so they didn't catch on immediately, but it definitely got the gears going in people's heads. So that definitely planted a seed. So this start of these rapid improvements in transport, communications, and technology enabled people to work globally. This really unlocked globalization for the industry, which we'll dive into now. So globalization, as you all know, is really spreading products, money, and tech across borders. And this was picked up very quickly by the fashion industry in the 80s to take advantage of low wages and minimal regulations in other parts of the world. Since, well, being arguably the most labor-intensive profession in the world, sewing is a prime candidate for offshoring. Generally, companies that offshored survived, and those chose not to, they didn't survive. NAFTA, which was signed in 1993, really helped to expedite the move, especially just offshore to Mexico from the States. And then the multi-fiber arrangement, which was started in 1974 and then was closed in 2005, in a way both increased and spread the numbers around the world, the amount of imports that we took from all other countries. It was a very strange system that kind of forced companies to try to keep the quota to retain it for the next year. So they would try to hit quotas in different parts of the world so they wouldn't lose it for the next year. But at the same time, once they hit that quota, they would have to move to a new country. So rather than just sourcing from one place where we got a lot of great deals, we were actually spreading the work all over the world. And this really helped to expedite globalization and move things faster, which probably wasn't the intention, but that's what came from it. And then when it was repealed in 2005, imports in the States from China specifically skyrocketed, because that was the part of the world that we really wanted to work in the most and wanted to import from the most. So it's very controversial on was that the right thing to do or not? Did it spread too much, or did it keep us from relying too much on just China? So as clothing got cheaper, people started buying more, and it was really a vicious cycle. Order quantities went from just a few thousands in the mid-century to the hundreds of thousands and sometimes in the millions during the 80s. Brands found that they could make product in excess and kind of guess about what consumers would buy, since the products were suddenly so cheap to make. And with how low quality and trendy the garments were, consumers needed to come back consistently for more. So to give a few numbers on how frequent that turnover is, Zara has a new line drop from like design to store display every 2 weeks. They constantly get feedback from stores, and they use grayish goods, which is undyed fabric and product, to give color last minute, which is smart, because color makes such a big difference on what people are going to buy. H&M and Forever 21 are replenishing daily. And then Topshop gets 400 new styles every week. From a selling standpoint, this is really brilliant because it encourages people to buy like they buy coffee or food, which obviously is horrendous for the environment, but from a business standpoint is what they want. With how cheap it all started to become, we all got hooked, and it became about turnover to win. And that's how fast fashion was born. As an example of extreme growth, Gap opened more than a store a day in 1999. So they opened almost 600 stores just in that 1 year alone. So remember at the beginning, we talked about people spending 15% of their incomes on clothing 100 years ago. So this was in around 1900. They were spending 15% of their income on clothing. Today, we spend between 1% and 3% of our income on clothing. Everything else in our lives has gotten way more expensive, and we've just accepted that. We pay more for gas, housing, education, movie tickets, healthcare. Everything has gone up, and we kind of expect that. But clothing actually decreased in absolute value over that period, and we still view clothing as too expensive because we don't know what its worth should be. Here's a chart that I think shows pretty well why we started to offshore in the 80s. These countries at the top were the ones that we initially started working with in the 80s to try to produce for us. And they initially were the ones that were the cheapest, and they had the infrastructure set up, which is not a lot, but they had it ready to get going. But now things, it's more than 30 years have gone by. Now these countries down here at the bottom are the ones that really look great because they're so much cheaper. This is how much a worker would make in a month sewing clothing. So Ethiopia looks much more attractive than Turkey, which is $340. It's over 10 times as much. If we put the US on here, well, it doesn't even fit. But if we put the US on here, it'd be well over 4 times the amount that China is up here. And of course, the jobs in the States went down. The people sewing and being employed in general by this industry went way down during this point of globalization, because we offshored the jobs. We talked about earlier, 95% of the clothes that were sold in the States in the mid-century, so 1950s to 1960, at that point, that 95% was made in the US. And then we jumped to 1990 here, and now we're down to 50% of the clothes that are purchased or that are sold in the US are made in the US. And then today, which is not on this chart, but 2021, 10 years after this, just 2% of the clothes that are sold in the US are made in the US. So we went from 95 to 50 to 2. And the span of years, it was 40-year span, the first one, and then just a 30-year span in the next. So we're rapidly, I mean, you can't go much further than 2%, but that is what we've seen so far. And then for scale, we have increased. So we've offshored the amount of clothing that is made, but overall in the world, the amount of clothing has exploded. So in 2000, 50 billion garments were made in the world. So way more than the number of people. And then in 2014, that number doubled. We went to 100 billion garments made in the US that year. Now, some sources say we're at 150 billion garments. Definitely not last year in 2020, because there were so many canceled orders with COVID, but somewhere between 100 and 150 garments are generally made each year about now. And then around the same time, the industry is going from $1 trillion market to it's expected to break $2 trillion in 2025. This is an example of the life cycle, or the lifeline of our garments. The life of our products, they're linear, because we don't have a plan for the end of use, and we don't design products for circularity. This not only contributes to waste, of course, but it also contributes to pollution and to carbon emissions, because each product is starting from scratch. You're not piggybacking off of a previous process. It's always going back to square one. And the products really just don't last that long. The highest values here, so these numbers are looking at the amount of CO2 emissions per year in gigatons. So the highest numbers here are for yarn prep and for dyeing and finishing. And the reason that CO2 emissions are so high for those are because they require a lot of heat. Require a lot of heat for cleaning at yarn prep, and a lot of heat for dye take in the dyeing and finishing stage. And then down here, this is a little misleading with the distribution being so low, but it's really only because we ship an insane amount of clothing around the world, so it just gets, the emissions gets distributed over that. But we don't need to be shipping that much clothing. So for the clothing that people would actually be using, I think this number would really skyrocket. So looking at that same lifeline, but applied to a particular garment, this is for jeans, going through the whole process from fiber to yarn to fabric to assembly to distribution and then end of life. So looking at the amount of water used here, about 10,000 liters of water is used to make one pair of jeans through this process. Some people would say that's the equivalent of what one person would drink over 10 years of their life. It's a lot of water. There's a lot used at the growing, especially for cotton, a lot used in dyeing, and then a lot used in finishing, which isn't shown here, but finishing jeans, getting that distressed or washed look. And for waste and pollution, there are a lot of pesticides at growing, a lot of toxic chemicals at dyeing, 10% waste for scrap at cutting, and then 30% waste at distribution, because at least 30% doesn't get sold. And then we also know that this all eventually goes to waste. There are ways to recycle that we'll review later, but eventually it all ends up over there. And then for carbon emissions, just like in the graph we looked at previously, the yarn prep stage and the dyeing and finishing stage, those are very high because of the amount of heat that they require. And then with denim, dyeing comes before the fabric stage because it's a yarn dye. You color the yarn and then you make it into a fabric. And then the finishing comes after the assembly because you want to have like the seams and the other parts of the jeans be part of the look. So even though fashion is pretty handmade and pretty manual, a lot of changes happen to get us to this point. Tools have helped us since the very beginning, especially automated and mechanized tools, starting with the power loom in the late 1700s. We've since been able to increase efficiency by making huge batches of the same thing using sizing systems. And then, as we discussed, the information flow that tech brought in the late 1900s allowed us to take advantage of cheap labor. So over time, the cost decreased with these new efficiencies, but so did inclusion and sustainability. Inclusion went down with efficiencies, sustainability went down with efficiencies. We today have a more wasteful and more discriminatory industry because of our efficiencies. So human behavior is stuck because we won't be able to change our consumption habits. And even if we could, the middle class around the world that's growing rapidly, especially in Asia and Africa, shouldn't have to do that. So consumption in general is exploding. It would be really unfair for us to deny them the prosperity that we've enjoyed for so long. We're progressively contributing more and more to climate change with the fashion industry's practices and our consumption patterns. The industry is stuck in a pattern of overproduction and make waste, and it's incrementally optimized itself into a corner of dependence on a push model. People expect to find what they want, so we overproduce with the hope we can get them something. But we make really bad product because we need to drive down costs to support our crazy big quantities. So this is really a pivotal time in fashion. We could either go way downhill from 92 million tons of waste per year to an unfortunate 134 million tons of waste per year, which is slated for 2030 at this rate. Or we could really support new promising innovations and initiatives to enable a circular fashion economy. We need really drastic, epic changes and solutions. We really need an overhaul to make sure the fashion industry is not responsible for our demise.